Jim of Shiloh Kahal. I want to see if I can do a brief video on the subject of a second calendar existing at the time of Messiah. I have recently put out some videos explaining, according to the timelines you can pull out of the gospel accounts, that there clearly is a calendar that Messiah is keeping and a calendar that the Yehudim were keeping, because Messiah celebrated the Passover, which would have had to have been the 14th. And then the Yehudim, on the days being crucified, the day after Messiah already celebrated the Passover, they're doing their preparation day and trying to celebrate their Passover, which would have placed that day on the 14th for them. So Messiah had a 14th day that he was celebrating, and the Yehudim had a 14th day a day later that they were celebrating. Evidence that there are two maps. That you can find in the gospel accounts, but what about other evidences for the topic of a different calendar? So this video, it might be overly ambitious to try to keep it short, but I want to see if I can just do a high-level view of why we have a second calendar. Greece conquered Persia in around 321, I believe it was, BC, and then Alexander was the conqueror, dies, and we have the splitting of his kingdom. And for 100 years or so, the Ptolemies to the south controlled Judea, with the Seleucids to the north and east. Well, the Seleucids and the Ptolemies went to war, and the Seleucids conquered areas that the Ptolemies had previously controlled, and that included Judea. And that was around 197 BC. Well, under the Ptolemies, and even in the early years of the Seleucids controlling the land, they pretty much let Judea operate according to their ways. But with the coming of Antiochus Epiphanes in 175 BC, all things changed. And that's where we get, in my opinion, it is possible that calendar changes and all of the problems that we have related to the calendar and the Judaism approach to the day and the calendar, etc. Maybe that originated while they were in Babylon, but I think it more likely that it originated under the Greeks, and specifically came about under Antiochus Epiphanes. And let me see if I can explain that. Okay, to do that, I'm going to utilize Wikipedia here. And I'm going to the write-up on Antiochus Epiphanes, which, if you will open up the book of Daniel, the prophecy of Daniel alongside of it, you will just see how closely aligned it all is. And I may do a video on that because I find it extremely interesting, and just lay them out side by side. But that's not the point of this video, so I want to move forward through this history and biography, etc., down to just make the point that as to how things were being handled with regard to Judea and the Jews in the Maccabean revolt. So, according to this paragraph of the write-up, the Seleucids, like the Ptolemies before them, held a suzerainty over Judea, meaning that they respected Jewish culture and protected the Jewish institutions. However, this policy was drastically reversed by Antiochus IV. And what does that mean? And then let's turn to the write-up on Onias III, which was the not necessarily the last of the Zadokite priest, because his brother was related to him, but he's the last of the legitimate Zadokite priest. And let's just see what it says quickly here in his write-up. Onias III, son of Simon II, called Onias Simonides in Koine Greek, was high priest of Israel during the Second Temple period under the rule of the Seleucid Empire. He is described in the scriptures as a pious man who opposed the Hellenization of Judea, but he was usurped by his brother Jason after the ascension of Antiochus IV Epiphanes as ruler of the Seleucid Empire in 175 BC. Okay, and then I want to come to the account of Jason in Wikipedia, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, except for to note that he replaced his brother in 175 BC, and In this write-up, they say, it reads, some believe that Antiochus IV favored Hellenism, which or standardizing Greek culture across the widespread Seleucid lands more firmly, and Jason was more of a Hellenist than his brother. So Jason is considered the first of the Hellenist priests, the priests that were accepting the ways of the Greek, and that stands in contrast to his brother, Onias III, who had been resisting the ways of Greece. Okay, and now let's turn to the list of high priests given us in Wikipedia. And I don't want to spend a lot of time here. I just want to make some quick comments. Even Wikipedia understood that the high priest needed to belong to the Aaronic line. From the days of Moses and Aaron, in the very beginning, it was established that the sons of Aaron would serve in the role of high priest. Understood. And then we have from Exodus to Solomon's temple, they give us the high priest that sat. And then we had the advent of the first temple period, came about in the time of Solomon. And by this time, the initial two, there were 4 sons of Aaron, 2 died immediately. And then we had Eleazar and Phinehas, I believe, were the 2 sons and the lines that continued. And they did. If we look up here, we'll see that we have some... Abiathar was a son of Ahimelech. Some of these were from the line of Ithamar. I'm sorry, here's the son of Aaron. Yep, Ithamar and Phinehas. So the 2 lines that survived of Aaron were Ithamar and Phinehas. And here we had Eli and Ahitub both serving. One was of the line of Ithamar and one was the line of Phinehas. And this was all taking place in the days of of Joshua, in the days of the judges, in the days of Samuel, in the days of the first king Saul, and even through the days of David as king. It all changed, though, with Abiathar, the son of Ahimelech, turning against David and ultimately being removed from the office of high priest by Solomon when he rose to power, leaving Zadok, a descendant of Phinehas, as the sole remaining son of Aaron to sit in the role of high priest. And that's why we hear over and over again, you'll hear the sons of Zadok over and over again, because while all of the high priests had to be sons of Aaron at the time of Solomon, that had all been narrowed down to Zadok. So the surviving line of Aaron had to come from Zadok, the son of Zadok, the high priest, and his sons. And here are all of the priests that sat during the first temple period. And this is the account, by the way, from scriptures, and then this is Josephus in another account. But these are the high priests that served during that period of time, and that continued until Babylon. Babylon destroyed the temple, removed them off to Babylon, but even once they came back, then we had the rebuilding of the second temple, and we had the sons of Zadok sitting once again in the role of high priest. And that continues, and it continues until right here. Here is Onias III, who was removed by Antiochus Epiphanes in 175 BC and was replaced with his brother Jason, both sons of Simon, which made them both Zadokites in 175 BC. Which made Jason the last of the Zadokite dynasty, which means he's the last of the Zadoks, the sons of Zadok, to sit in the position. But even so, Jason was a Hellenizer. He was a stooge of Antiochus Epiphanes. Onias III was resistant to Hellenization. He was resistant to the calendar, etc. And that's why he was removed, by all accounts, by Antiochus. Antiochus wanted to Hellenize the entire Seleucid lands, the entirety of the Seleucid lands, and Onias sat in opposition to it. So he just removed him and replaced him with somebody who would go along, which was his brother Jason, who instituted the gymnasium in the area and did some different things. But even that wasn't enough, because in 172 BC, Antiochus IV replaced him with Menelaus, who was a full-on Hellenist, as was Alcimus. So with the beginning of Jason, and then through Menelaus, and then Alcimus, we had Hellenistic priests who were embracing and bringing to Judea the elements of Greek Greek authority. Their calendars, their laws, their ways, they began to bring them into the lands and confuse the lands. And then under Menelaus, we did have the rise of the Maccabees, and the Maccabees came on and succeeded under Judas Maccabee, and they wrested a lot of control back in the land, but they never fully won. Even when Antiochus IV died, and as they were continuing to win against the Seleucids and wresting control back of their areas, well, the Seleucids control a larger piece of land. So even when the Maccabeans ended up conquering the lands enough to where there was peace in the land again, they had to stay harmonious with the Greeks. And so the Greeks actually appointed Jonathan to this position again, and he accepted it. But then the Jews voted Simon in 143 BC. They voted Simon in and made the position hereditarian again, based on heredity again, so that it became, by counsel of the Jews against Torah, the high priest position became a Maccabean position. And that's what we continued in, is the Maccabees throughout the Hasmonean dynasty, to be replaced with the Herodians. In fact, if Yahushua would have been born somewhere around 4 BC, it would have been one of these high priests sitting in the position at the time. Doesn't really matter. The point is that we had illegitimate priests leading the temple, leading the Israeli people, the Yehudim, the lands of Judea. We had illegitimate leadership leading us into illegitimate understanding, leading Judea into illegitimate ways and illegitimate understandings. Okay, now let's turn to the book of 2nd Maccabees and see what it says about the issues taking place here, because the Maccabees, this is part of the history of this time period that the church doesn't really know, because Maccabees are not widely read in church circles. But in chapter 3 of 2nd Maccabees, we learned that when the Kodesh city was inhabited, let me get my pencil, with all peace, and the laws were guarded very well. Kind of important. The laws were being guarded very well because of the righteousness of Oniah the Kohen HaKadah. That is the high priest, and this is Onias III, and his hatred of wickedness. So according to 2nd Maccabees, this is the pushback of Oniah, keeping the laws of the Torah, the laws of Judea well, because he hated wickedness and he was striving to keep it so. But let's move to chapter 4 of 2nd Maccabees and read a little further. It says, in verse 7, but after the death of Seleucus, when Antiochus called Epiphanes took reign, Jason, the brother of Oniah, acted corruptly to be Kohen Haggadah. So here is Jason acting corruptly, promising the sovereign by intercession 360 talenton of silver and 80 talenton of another revenue. So Jason approached Antiochus and offered him money and usurped Onias from the position, and Antiochus replaced him. Which when the sovereign had granted and he had acquired the rulership into his hand, he promptly brought his own nation into Yahwanite manner. So here's the sovereign, here's Antiochus granting for money the position of Kohen Haggadah, which is the high priest, to Jason, and immediately upon taking and obtaining the position, once he had acquired the rulership of the high priesthood, because the high priest is in charge of temple service. He's in charge of the Levites. His leadership is going, just like when the president of the United States gets elected, his leadership spills out into the rest of the land. And that same thing would have been true of the high priesthood. And immediately he brought his own nation to the Yahwanite manner. And the Yahwanite manner is Greece. Yahwan is Greece. So the Yahwanite manner is the Greek manners, Hellenism. So immediately, this is where we're learning that Jason began Hellenizing his own country. And he took the royal privileges. He put down, let me just go to the highlighted portions here, and putting down the governments which were according to the law, he brought up new customs against the law. Okay, so they needed to keep the Moedim. Onias was holding fast to the calendar that he had, which would now we understand to be the Zadok calendar, the calendar that they would have been keeping as sons of Zadok. Immediately, I'm suggesting that Jason began to bring up the new customs, putting down, eliminating the things that Onias was holding on to, which I think would include the calendar, eliminating it and bringing the new customs of Greece into the lands and against the law. Now, let's keep reading in verse 13. Now, such was the height of the Yahwanite ways and the increase of Gentile manners through the exceeding profaneness of Jason, which is Jason, that wicked wretch and no high priest. I mean, he was the high priest, but the writer of 2nd Maccabees is saying he was no high priest. He should not have been sitting in that position because he was not holding and guarding the ways of Torah. He was replacing them with Hellenistic Yahwanite ways. That the Kohanim, which are the priests, had no heart to serve anymore at the altar. So the priests, when Jason took over, the priests began to despair of their position. And they had no heart to serve anymore at the altar, but despising the Heikel, which is the temple, and neglecting the slaughtering, which is the perpetual, continual slaughterings that were supposed to be taking place, they hastened to be partakers of the unlawful allowance in the exercise arena called out after striking the gong, and not remaining in the honors of their fathers, but loving the esteem of the Yahwanites above all. And for this reason severe calamity came upon them, for those whose customs they followed so earnestly, and to whom they desired to be like in every way, came to be their enemies and avengers. For it is not a light thing to do wickedly against the laws of Elohim. So what are we reading here in 2nd Maccabees? That the ways of Yahuwah, the Torah, they were violated by Jason and replaced. And then the priest that he was in control of began to go along as well. Now, what happens when leaders come about? People tend to follow the leaders, and this was the new leadership to mainstream Yehuda at this point in time. We have the high priests who are supposed to be in charge. The common person doesn't really know all the politics and all the things going on. All they know is that Onias is no longer the high priest, and Jason is leading them into new ways, and they're following. So that's how I'm confident that is how we ended up with a complete changing away from the ways of Torah to another way. I think the calendar was changed at this time to embrace the Greek calendar, and that was never changed back. So that by the time that Yahushua came about, the calendar that the Zadoks would have been keeping was no longer the calendar that mainstream Yehuda would have been keeping. Okay, and let's just go a little bit further, because after Jason came Menelaus, and 3 years afterwards, Jason sent Menelaus, the brother of the same Shimeon, to take the silver. But he, being brought to the presence of the sovereign, when he had exalted him for the splendid appearance of his power, obtained the kahuna for himself, offering more than Jason by 300 talanton of silver. So basically, Menelaus now approached the sovereign, which would have been Antiochus Epiphanes, offered him more money than Jason, and so Antiochus removed Jason and replaced him with Menelaus. And what does it say about Menelaus? He came with the sovereign's authority, bringing nothing worthy of the high kahuna, the high priest, but having the fury of a cruel tyrant and the rage of a savage beast. And then Jason, who had undermined his own brother, being undermined by another, was compelled to flee to the land of the Ammonites. Okay, so then what became of the sons of Zadok? Once Onias was kicked out of the office, did they just go away? I don't think so. And I don't think that the sons of Zadok followed Onias IV down into Egypt. I think the sons of Zadok coalesced. They became a grouping of people that had been exiled from the positions that they were supposed to be in, but they did not go away. But they were no longer centered around the temple where they had been, they had to find a new place to go. And I believe that would be Qumran, what we have come to understand as Qumran today, what would have been known in the days of Messiah as Bethabara, and it's referred to in the King James Version and some of the other versions. It's referred to as Bethabara. So it's to this place that I believe that they went and formed a community that we understand today as Qumran. Out of this came the Dead Sea Scrolls. And here, let's just take a look at what Qumran would have looked like. Here are some pictures, and I'll just kind of open them up as we go. Here's the compound of Qumran. Here's a picture of it. Here is a drawing of the compound of Qumran that would have been in Bethabara. Here are some of the baptismals that existed in that area. Here are some of the caves and some of the surrounding things around Qumran and Bethabara. Here's another view of the caves, and here's the the area of Qumran or Bethabara here. Here's another picture of the compound of Bethabara. So this I hold, which I don't think that they built. I think it already existed, but they built it up, and this became the area out of which we get that community that I know. This is where we get our discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, because when the Zadoks came here, they began to accumulate the scriptures that they understood to be true scriptures, and they had a library of scriptures here that they were maintaining. And we can see the writings, because not only did they keep all of the scriptures around, like the Torah and some of the prophets and different things, but they also made some of their own writings and spoke of the wicked priests and the things that were happening. So they began to describe the times, and this all would have existed, this compound would have existed from, say, 165 BC, during the period of time of the Hasmonean dynasty and the Maccabean priests. They would have existed here, and they would have been referring to the priests in the temple as the wicked priests, because it's the illegitimate priesthood. The legitimate priesthood was existing here in Qumran. This area became known as the Way, and it was a minority within the larger Yehudim community, Jewish community, because the larger Jewish community of Judea would have been following the leadership of the temple, would have been following the ways, and that those ways would have overcome the land, which I think would have brought an errant calendar. And the Zadokite compound, though, would have been holding on to the correct calendar. And what do we find when we get into the Dead Sea Scrolls writings that were ultimately, because the Dead Sea Scroll was destroyed in 70 AD along with Judea and Jerusalem, and that's when they hid those scrolls. What did we find in there? We found lots of information related to the calendar. So, by all appearances, we go to Qumran to see where the Zadokites set up. And the Zadokites would have brought true Torah, true calendar, true information, the true scriptures, and they would have added validity to what we were seeing in the land. So the true ways of Torah, the true ways of Israel, would have followed them here and not stayed with the temple. I would say this is also verified and justified when we get into the days of John the Baptist, and let me explain. So here's a map of the area, and here, let me get my markup, here is where Qumran was located, which is also the area of Bethabara, just beyond the Jordan Valley over to here. And this also is the Judean wilderness. This is where, when John the Baptist was born and when he went out into the wilderness, I am convinced that this is where he went, because he went and he joined these folks at Qumran and became a priest there of the lineage of Zadok, which he was of the lineage of Zadok. And that's why, well, before I continue with that, let me show you another picture here, because here's drawing of the Judean wilderness. All of this was considered the Judean wilderness. Let me see if I can find one more picture of the Judean wilderness. Here's another depiction of the Judean wilderness. Let me see if I can make that a little bigger and mark that up. Here's the Judean wilderness here. And here would be Qumran and Bethabara, somewhere right around this Judea, maybe a little further up here. But in this area, and this is where I think John the Baptist went went to. And this is also then the area that, or I'm going to say that it appears that this compound, these ways, John the Baptist as a priest coming out of this area of Qumran, was validated by Yahushua, because this is where he came for his baptism, which would be his anointing for his ministry. He didn't come to the temple priests or Jerusalem or the temple there in Jerusalem. He came to John in the wilderness here, beyond the Jordan Valley, which would have been up here. This is Jordan Valley. So beyond, he came here to get his baptism. It's possible he was baptized in the Jordan River, but it's also possible that he was baptized in the baptismals of Qumran. It's not quite as clear. It really doesn't matter. He would have been baptized by John the Baptist, who was clearly a priest and almost certainly then of this area. Validated by Yahushua in many respects and in many ways. And then ultimately you could see the disdain of Yahushua, Messiah, against the Jewish priests and the Jewish temple throughout his entire ministry, talking about their, the various laws that they were creating that were laws of men, doctrines of men, not doctrines of Yahweh. So they were adding to the oral traditions, they were adding things to the Torah that didn't belong. Okay. So then when we get to the content of what we would have found in those Dead Sea Scrolls, I would refer you to Rachel Elior. And here is one of basically she gave a lecture that many people have produced. Here's one where the University of Chicago has produced it. And if you go to this, if you go here, you would be able to listen to the lecture by Rachel Elior. Well, she's a Jewish scholar in this arena, and she analyzes the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I will tell you, when you listen to this lecture, you're going to hear over and over again that she thinks that, first of all, she thinks it's almost certainly the Zadoks and not the Essenes. And she will say that not the scriptures that they find, but when we get to the writings of members of this community, the dispute, she says over and over again, between the community and the evil priests and the ways of the temple, the dispute was all over the calendar. That it seems to be that the calendar and the correct keeping of the calendar was the high dispute of the day. Well, don't take my word for it. Listen to her. Go to this video and watch the video. It's a very interesting watch. I just loved it. But she'll introduce to you the idea that the mainstream Yehuda and what we saw in that community were two different calendars, and there was one of the primary disputes between the two. So we had this battle of this small community of what would be Zadokite remnants, those who were holding true to the Torah, affirmed by Yahushua, the Messiah, when he came, standing against the larger society of Judea that had become Hellenized under Jason and Menelaus and Alcimus, and then not really being fixed when the Maccabeans and the Hasmonean dynasty came into that position. It was never fixed, even if some of the Maccabees were earnest in their ways. Later Hasmoneans were not, and so they never fixed it. So the priesthood became evil, not keeping the laws of Torah, keeping the laws that they had developed to get along with the Greeks in the course of Hellenism, turning to the Greek ways. So, in summary, if I could finish up here, I'll just point you again to Rachel's video here. I'm going to just say that, and I'm going to affirm, I'm pretty confident, after as much as I have been spending time in this, educating myself, immersing myself in it, it seems very evident that it was during the time of Antiochus, when these particular high priests came to power, that we saw the Hellenization of Judea. And we saw the corruption of the calendar. We saw the corruption of Torah. We saw the corruption, we saw the advent of the oral traditions. And we see all sorts of corruption that, unfortunately, the church and even in the Torah communities were turning to what came out of that period of time, post-Hellenism. We're turning to that to get our evening to evening day, to get the calendar that the Yehudim were keeping at the time of Messiah's coming. That's why we see Messiah and his Talmidim honoring the Passover on one day. They come out, it would have had to have been the 14th, and they went and killed the Passover, celebrated their Passover meal, went to the garden, went to the Mount of Olives, where Jesus was arrested, and then the next day, which would have been the 15th on their calendar, a Sabbath to them, and the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, that was the day that he was brought before Pilate and then crucified. And yet we see that the Yehudim, the mainstream of Yehudim, were keeping this day as their preparation and their Passover day as the 14th. And they can't both coexist. So we're either going to follow Yahushua and his observance of the 14th, the day before, which would have been according to the calendar that the Zadokite priesthood was keeping, or we're going to follow the calendar and the timing of mainstream Yehuda that had been Hellenized. Well, thank you, and may you be Baruch. If you find what I've been sharing of value, then please like, share, and subscribe.